Good afternoon, all CHP listeners everywhere in this warming world. Laszlo Montgomery here, as always, with another China History Podcast episode. This one's special for all you lovelies out there who tell me in your kind emails how much you prefer the topics from ancient China rather than from modern times. Well, that's understandable, of course, and I could see why so many of you feel that way. And when it comes to ancient Chinese history, the Zhou dynasty, former and latter, Western and Eastern, is a bottomless reservoir of stories and noteworthy figures, not to mention a few good Chengyus too. Why grand strategy gaming companies haven't embraced this time period is beyond me. Even I would play that game. And today I'm featuring someone from the Warring States period who, frankly speaking, isn't nearly as well known as his fellow philosophers of that great age. I wanted to talk about Guiguzi and the 4 or 5 people who were most associated with his story. Over the past several weeks since I commenced work on this episode, I've been randomly asking people who were familiar with Chinese history if they had ever heard of Guiguzi. Surprisingly, I found poor old Guiguzi is pretty obscure. Even Michael Love's great Plico app, which lists pretty much everything one might need in a Chinese-English dictionary, no listing for Guiguzi. My stalwart dictionary going back to 1979, Liang Shiqiu's New Practical Chinese-English Dictionary, no Guiguzi. And I just found out from Graham Earnshaw the other day, that was also his 词典 of choice. And the Oxford Chinese Dictionary? Yeah, don't bother looking up Guiguzi. In Wikipedia, they gave him a little face, but there isn't enough rice in there to even make a bowl of thin kanji. Even the 2007 50-volume Library of Chinese Classics, published under the auspices of the China government, includes every major classical work from Zhou to Qing. Did they include Guiguzi? They did not. In many ancient texts, he gets a mention here and there, alluding to the original wisdom contained in the Guiguzi. And there are also the occasional mentions that so-and-so admired him or had some relationship with him. And the Guiguzi is written about in the Book of Sui, the Book of Song, and excerpts from the Guiguzi also made it to the Siku Qianshu, the Qianlong Emperor's compilation of all known Chinese works worth keeping. Guiguzi, the person, pops up in some early texts as this mysterious, hermit-like sage, and artists will often use his likeness in paintings, on scrolls and ceramics. Whatever we know of him comes from sources written centuries after he lived, if he lived at all. That's the main problem. He's kind of a Lao Tzu figure. Aside from the name he's known by and the text associated with him being one and the same, there's no real hard evidence of his actual existence as a human being. Just a famous text that was said to have been written by him. I was sitting in Las Vegas at the Pet Products Show with my friend William, and he seemed to know quite a lot about the life of this so-called sage of Ghost Valley and about all the main personages from China history who were associated with Guiguzi. These being Su Qin, Zhang Yi, Sun Bin, Pang Juan, and later, when Taoism embraced the 4th century BC text, Tao Hong Jing, the Guiguzi as a text never made it to the Wu Jing Qi Shu, the 7 military classics of China, but it's still considered, by traditionalists at least, as quite venerable and influential. So today, let's take a look at Guiguzi and the eponymous work that is sometimes referred to as the Bizu, or earliest ancestor of Zongheng or the School of Diplomacy, one of the 100 schools that flourished and contended back in the time of all the great sages like Confucius, Mengzi, Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, Mozi, and so many others from that era. And from introducing the life of Guiguzi, we can refresh our memories about his famous students. It's said he taught 500 students between 378 and 322 BC, a fertile period in world civilization. This was also the time of Plato, Aristotle, Philip II and his son Alexander the Great, the rise of legalism in China, and the death of Alexander in 323 BC. I mentioned the most famous among this group of students, Su Qin, Zhang Yi, Su Qin, and Pang Juan. Very powerful and influential men in their day. And for this episode, we'll take a ride back to the 4th century BC and look at how these four men left their mark on China's Bronze Age history. When they lived, it was already more than a century into the Warring States period. And with a name like that, you know it wasn't a peaceful time in China. This was the time when 4 of the 7 military classics were developed in China. The Guiguzi, as a book, is called the first great work of Chinese rhetoric. When it's recalled, it's usually as a military treatise, and because of the large overlap between rhetoric, or the art of persuasion, and military strategy, and diplomacy too, it ended up becoming mostly remembered in the same category as The Art of War by Sun Tzu. By definition, rhetoric is the art or science of all specialized literary uses of language in prose or verse, including figures of speech, the art of making persuasive speeches, and the art of influencing the thought and conduct of an audience or of a single person. I'm thinking today, in these mean times, most people are familiar with rhetoric's other definition of undue use of exaggeration or display or bombast. But 23, 24 centuries ago, it was an art form that was meant to persuade and to influence. The Guiguzi was one of those innumerable texts that got lost to eternity, if it even existed in Guiguzi's alleged time back in the Eastern Zhou. As far as Guiguzi is concerned, we either take it or leave it with regard to the scant details left to us by Sima Qian. He stated that Guigu Xiansheng, Mr. Guigu, he was the teacher of Su Qin and Zhang Yi. And that statement, written by the grand historian, is all we have to riff on as far as Guiguzi's biography goes. Thankfully, in Guiguzi's case at least, others kept his memory alive and spoke of him, and the sage of Ghost Valley became less amorphous, though still rather mysterious. That's what that means. Guigu means Ghost Valley, and Zi is an ancient title of respect for a learned or virtuous man. Many argue the Guiguzi was written during the Han Dynasty, long after Guiguzi's time, and whatever claims of this being an authentic Warring States text were false. And because the probability is rather high, this is a contributory factor to the lack of respect paid to this work. So let's all take a leap of faith in what the ancient documents tell us. Master Guigu, Guigu Da Shi, he was also called Xuan Weizi, the master of the obscure minimum, one of the sages gifted with the wisdom of heaven and earth and all the laws of nature and the mysteries of heaven. He was a native of Chu, but there are conflicting accounts of his origin. One text mentioned he was born during the time of Duke Ping of Jin, but that was in the middle of the late 6th century BC. The famous Taoist priest from the late Tang, Du Guangting, author of the collection Lu Yi Ji, alleges that Guiguzi was called Wang Xu, and that he had lived as a xianren, an immortal, since the time of the Yellow Emperor. He lived in seclusion in a place called Guigu, or Ghost Valley. This is believed to be around Yunmeng Mountain, today's Yuzhou, Henan, just to the west of Xuchang. So, basically, around ground zero of ancient China. And if you had to whittle him down to a soundbite, he's considered China's first teacher of You Shui, the art of persuasion. And since persuasion is so central to the art of diplomacy, that's how he earned the moniker of the founder of the Zongheng Jia, or School of Diplomacy, or Diplomacy and Strategy, as it was also known. And how it came to be called Zongheng, we'll talk about that too. Before the Guiguzi became one of the early works of military strategy, it was first a work of rhetoric. The book focused on four main fields: rhetoric, divination, the art of war, and Taoist self-cultivation. So let's look at the rhetoric part first. I guess the most amazing thing that's often pointed to about the Guiguzi being China's first guide for rhetoric was that it dovetailed nicely with Karl Jasper's axial age theory that contended between 800 to 200 BC, all the foundations that underlie current civilization came into being all over the world. During the axial age, rhetoric emerged in classical Greece and warring states, Zhou dynasty China. Both civilizations at the same time invented rhetoric as an oral mechanism that could be employed by those trained in it to resolve issues between states. It was a craft that allowed these persuaders, or you shui, to find ways to seek out compromises that would be to both parties mutual satisfaction, ultimately avoiding the need for war and violence, which is what the art of war teaches as well. In classical Greece, rhetoric was said to have been invented in the city-state of Syracuse in the 5th century BC. Rhetoric is one of the three arts of discourse, along with logic and grammar, that make up the trivium. If you were a student in ancient Greece, these were your core subjects. And then during the Middle Ages, these three subjects, along with the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, comprised the so-called 7 liberal arts. Aristotle called rhetoric the power of perceiving in everything that which is capable of producing persuasion. That's one of the primary definitions of rhetoric, the art of making persuasive speeches. And before you can do that, there's a lot of prep work involved. The Guiguzi is clearly a work of rhetoric. It teaches how to get people to do what you want them to do, while at the same time leading them to believe it was their idea to act in the way that you suggested. Rhetoric has an oversized impact on how we reason and persuade, how we speak, and how we write. In the 4th century BC, this way of looking at language was just evolving and becoming an art, and those particularly skilled in rhetoric were able to impact how states were governed and how diplomacy was carried out. Aristotle, who lived 384 to 322 BC, shared a lot in common with Guiguzi, and they were contemporaries of each other. Aristotle's On Rhetoric, and the text later called the Guiguzi, emerged around the same time. Greek rhetoric, as taught by Aristotle, spoke to a wider audience. It was meant to address a group, like at the Agora. The teachings contained in the Guiguzi speak more to one person, who in this case would be any number of rulers during the Warring States period. The Guiguzi was actually meant as a self-help guide for philosophers. It coaches one on the essence of interpersonal relationships and strategy. Socrates believed rhetoric was inconsistent with the truth because persuasion didn't care so much about the veracity of anything and only about a specific outcome. Some thinkers believed the use of rhetorical manipulation didn't pay heed to ethical consequences. This is one reason why Confucianists also rejected anything that came from the school of diplomacy. If you recall from that History of Chinese Philosophy series, you had all these wandering Ru philosophers like Confucius, Mengzi, Xunzi, and Mozi, who wandered from state to state, and their objective was to find that perfect ruler who they could attach themselves to, and through their wise counsel, help them to rule the state. They would teach their Ru doctrines that later became known as Confucianism in the West, and do their utmost to convince rulers to act with morality, always practicing virtue and benevolence in how they ruled their realms. And Confucianism called for a perfect ruler at the top, doing everything in accordance with the Confucian Tao, who would serve as the model for the people. And everyone would live in harmony, and everyone knew their place in society and what their role was. A perfect world where everyone did the right thing. And it was the same with these you shuis, these diplomatists or persuaders. They too would wander the warring states and try to get rulers to adopt their ideas and strategies. And these you shuis, who made up the Zhongheng or school of diplomacy, they advised rulers in political, military, and foreign affairs. As the Guiguzi states, quote, "The righteous man who disdains riches cannot be seduced by benefits, but can be coaxed if one speaks to him of frugality. The valiant warrior who scorns difficulties will be undaunted by fear, yet he can be defeated if skillful advantage is taken of his inclination for risk. The wise man can only be approached through calculation and the light of reason, and hence one should not try to outwit him through honesty, but rather by making him believe that one is using rational means and convincing him through adeptness alone." End quote. It advocates for strategy, rhetoric, and diplomacy rather than righteousness and morality like what the Ru philosophers called for. Confucianist rhetoric had more of a humanistic view of language, persuasion, and argumentation. What these school of diplomacy philosophers cared for was results. The ethics involved, and even the truth, had to sit in the back seat. So you can see later on in the Han Dynasty, after the triumph of Confucianism, thanks to Dong Zhongshu and Emperor Wu of Han, the school of diplomacy and their conniving ways came in for a good old-fashioned drubbing. The Guiguzi indicates that the justice of an argument or the necessity of proof are not so important. The main point, constantly reiterated, is not to displease the person one is attempting to persuade for fear of retribution, most commonly exile, but not infrequently execution. Guiguzi taught, more than anything else, you needed to gain insight into the listener's motivations, what made them tick, how to press their buttons. Once you discovered that, persuasion became much easier. You simply played to their vanities, predispositions, and weaknesses to ease them into a position where they're more persuadable. The Guiguzi says information about the intended audience and the situation is essential to persuasion. You had to be fully briefed on the lay of the land before you knew what to say. The wisdom contained in the Guiguzi had applications in military strategy, diplomacy, the economy, in trade and commerce, and debating and oratory skills. The Guiguzi resembles a tactical manual, listing a variety of means of bettering one's opponent. The orator, like the military strategist, must be able to expose their opponents so that they can completely scrutinize and interpret the most hard-to-detect clues that are revealed. In this way, they can draw out their opponent's most secret thoughts. It didn't take long for Guiguzi to be called the father of Moyue or Bingjia, strategy and military strategy. As I said, what began as a book on rhetoric evolved into a treatise on military strategy.
Do you love watching 90 Day Fiancé, but you're extremely uncomfortable about it because it's embarrassing as hell, and your partner and friends want to throw open their mouths when you talk about it?
Subscribe to the only podcast that takes this train wreck sort of seriously and generally fails to do so.
Starring a fat weirdo who lives in the woods and a forgetful, dumb mom brain, you'll love not understanding any of our 6 years of inside jokes as we tear apart these complete psychopaths, fulfilling your desperate need for a parasitic podcast relationship.
Subscribe to 90 Day Fiancé Cray Cray today, wherever you get podcasts.
The stories behind Guiguzi's two most famous students never go out of style. I'm still trudging through the Da Qin Di Guo miniseries, and I'm well into season 2 that features Zhang Yi during the time of King Huiwen of Qin. Zhang Yi has been mentioned a few times in past CHP episodes. Zhang Yi and Su Qin were a couple of you shuis, traveling worthies or mercenary diplomats who were always prospecting for opportunities to advise rulers. We've heard it so often. Let's look at the Zhongheng philosophy. Zhongheng is an abbreviation of He Zong Lian Heng. By itself, Zhongheng means length and breadth, vertical and horizontal. Literally, it means warp and weft of a textile fabric. These two most famous students of Guiguzi, Su Qin and Zhang Yi, They're remembered for their 纵横战略, vertical 纵 and horizontal 横 war strategies. A 合纵 vertical strategy was developed by Su Qin to unite all the weaker states against one mighty state. Lianheng horizontal strategy was developed by Zhang Yi and proved effective for the strongest state to defeat the weakest states. If that doesn't mean anything to you, as soon as you know the story of Su Qin and Zhang Yi, you'll have it all figured out. So this whole history of the vertical and horizontal strategy all came from the time of King Huiwen of Qin. His father, Duke Xiao, had Shangyang to advise him, and Huiwen had Zhang Yi. And Zhang Yi, he was a student of Guiguzi, and he too was one of these traveling salesmen, so to speak, who sought out a ruler who he could give wise counsel to. Su Qin, too, he was a student of Guiguzi, and he too left the master and struck out on his own. And Su Qin, he was the one who developed the vertical strategy idea. Su Qin came from Luoyang, and when he decided to leave Guigu Dashi, Master Guigu, he lived the life of a wandering you shui. And he knocked on every door that was out there, but this whole idea of striking out on his own was going nowhere. And there's an old story concerning Su Qin's family. His parents, his wife, they all completely rejected him and excoriated him for his neglect of his family, constantly wandering around China all these years, ignoring them and having nothing to show for his efforts. And, as Avon Barksdale could have told you, family is everything. And when you lose that, you got nothing. So Su Qin could only lament this great loss and keep on keeping on. But Su had a reversal in his misfortunes, with a mighty Qin dynasty all fortified and buff from Shangyang and Duke Xiao's new reforms. The other 6 warring states were all shaking in their boots. This late in the 4th century BC, Qin was the most powerful among the 7 warring states. And with all the rhetorical skills he picked up studying under Guiguzi, Su Qin tried one more time, as the story went, and knocked on the royal door of King Huiwen of Qin first. King Huiwen showed him the door right quick for reasons related to his hatred of Shangyang and all of these traveling worthies and others of Shangyang's ilk. He had reason to hold a grudge against these advisors, and he carried it still. If you need a refresher course on the House of Ying and their Qin state and later Qin dynasty, go try out the 3-part series on the rise and fall of the Qin, CHP episodes 157, 158, and 158B. Don't ask why the B. Striking out in Qin, Su Qin went on to speak to the rulers of other states. And he went to Yan and persuaded them to make an alliance with Qi to shore up their defenses against a potential Qin attack. And this ended up spooking the state of Zhao, who was feeling a little left out. And Su Qin then went to Wei, and after he had called on all the rulers of all 6 states with varying degrees of commitment and enthusiasm, all agreed with Su Qin's vertical alliance strategy. It was like a NATO kind of thing. All 6 states were united against Qin, who was, as I said, militarily the most powerful of the warring states. So this vertical alliance strategy, formed in 333 BC, in theory, appeared united and strong. And the vertical alliance, without question, was a threat to Qin, and this kept King Huiwen up at night. And fearing the existential threat of 6 against 1, he decided to have second thoughts about his dislike for these men like Su Qin, who went around stirring things up, using their silver tongues and rhetorical powers of persuasion. There was a famous quote that came out of the Liu Song dynasty, 420 to 479, that went, quote, "The eloquence of one man was more weighty than the 9 cauldrons, and a 3-inch tongue was stronger than 1,000,000 troops," end quote. This pointed out how much more effective the art of persuasion can be compared to a great army. And for cobbling this whole alliance together, Su Qin was lauded in all 6 states. He achieved renown throughout the land. His grand strategy that employed his vertical alliance system allowed all the allies to rest easy just in case you-know-who invaded your land. But Su Qin ignored that one weak link in this strategy. People, as Han Feizi would readily tell you, they ain't no good. And no sooner was the ink dry on this Grande Alliance, human nature took over, and the coalition, which was always tenuous, started developing cracks and fissures. Enter Zhang Yi, one of the main characters in Season 2 of Da Qin Di Guo, and for this reason he's fresh in my mind, the theatrical Zhang Yi, that is. Zhang Yi came from Wei State and studied under Guiguzi. Like Su Qin, he too struck out on his own. He went to Chu State, and just as faithfully reconstructed in the miniseries I'm watching now, Zhang Yi angered enough of the local Chu residents so that he got roughed up pretty badly and made to feel most unwelcome down there. So around 329 BC, Zhang Yi made his way to Xianyang, to Qin State, and with this vertical alliance in place, keeping the king of Qin up every night, he was a little more amenable to some sound advice. And Zhang Yi soon found himself in the employ of King Huiwen. A year later, Zhang Yi led Qin against his former homeland of Wei. And despite this loss to Qin, which included a sizable chunk of Wei territory, the vertical alliance still stood. But over the next several years, Zhang Yi advised his king Huiwen on ways to slowly dissolve this alliance. And using his silver tongue and skills presumably learned under the tutelage of Guiguzi, Zhang Yi was able to persuade each ruler of each state to abandon the alliance for the sake of their own self-interests or survival. He moved around between 325 to 309 BC, serving not only Qin, but other states as well. And Zhang Yi's goal was clear: to disrupt the alliances forged during Su Qin's era and divide the enemy. And by adopting this horizontal alliance system, going from state to state and lobbying them each individually, convincing each one to act in a certain way, he was able to sow enough discord whereby the alliance ultimately broke down. And from that point on, there was no stopping the Qin. The story of Su Qin and Zhang Yi goes hand in hand with the stories of Sun Bin and Pang Juan. This is one of the marquee tales from their respective lives, and they too were students of Guiguzi, and they too, one day, struck out on their own. According to the Dongzhou Lieguo Zhi, the Chronicles of the Eastern Zhou Kingdoms, Sun Bin and Pang Juan were also Guiguzi's students. And one day, Pang Juan heard that King Hui of Wei was in the market to zhao xian, to hire people of talent to serve the state. So Pang Juan left Guiguzi to join Wei, and within a very short time, Pang had proven himself as an advisor and military strategist. And his background as a student of Guiguzi probably didn't hurt his brand either. And soon he made his way up to the head of the Wei military. Sun Bin remained behind, and this was when Guiguzi gave him a copy of Sun Tzu's Art of War. And Guiguzi told Sun Bin whoever mastered Sun Tzu's Bing Fa would have no rivals in the world. And before he moved on, Guiguzi also gave Sun Bin a silk brocade bag. This is when Pang Juan, upon the advice of Mozi, it said, invited his old fellow student Sun Bin to join him in Wei. You see, the thing was that back in the day, when they were living in Ghost Valley, in Guigu, and being taught by the master there, Pang Juan knew on that mountain in Henan that Sun Bin was the more promising among them. And this gnawed at Pang Juan's self-esteem. And though Sun Bin never did anything to flex in front of Pang Juan, Pang carried this in the back of his mind all these years. And now, having achieved all that he had in Wei State, he schemed to invite his fellow student to join him in Wei. And he had something up his sleeve that would help him deal with his insecurities about Sun Bin. Before Sun Bin left Ghost Valley for Wei, Guiguzi changed the Chinese character for his name, Bin, which means guest, to Bin, which means kneecap. It also has an archaic usage meaning to slash or remove the kneecaps as punishment, or to kneecap someone. Ouch. So Pang Juan laid a trap and invited Sun Bin to come to Wei, and he promised to this one-time sworn brother of his, together they could take Wei to great heights, not to mention stand up to Qin's rising power. Sun Bin went to Wei, and in no time at all, Pang Juan sprung his trap and got Sun Bin tangled up in a web of intrigue. And Pang Juan duly reported to King Hui, the ruler of Wei. Now, don't confuse him with King Hui Wen of Qin, who also went by King Hui. Pang Juan, so skilled in the teachings of Guiguzi, was able to convince the king of Wei to find Sun Bin guilty of treason. Sun Bin was thereupon convicted and sentenced to death, but with crocodile tears flowing, Pang Juan rose up to defend Sun Bin and advocated for leniency. He suggested to Wei King Hui, why not just tattoo his face and remove his kneecaps as punishment? If we do that, we won't have to worry about some other contending state hiring him as an advisor. And as the story is told, Pang Juan got his sworn brother off the hook, and only this gruesome punishment needed to be carried out, which it was. And after the nasty deed was done, Pang Juan went to visit Sun Bin and pretended to comfort him, and he didn't let on that this suffering that Sun Bin was going through was all due to his perfidy. And during his period of convalescing, Pang Juan convinced Sun Bin to record the entirety of all his wisdom and knowledge about strategy and to write his own Sun Zi Bing Fa. He shared the same surname as the late 6th century Sun Zi or Sun Wu, whose art of war is so renowned even in our day. Sun Bin claimed he was a descendant of Sun Wu, and later on he too will be given the honorific master title to his name. But his Sun Bin Bing Fa will be much less renowned than the one credited to Sun Wu. In fact, some argue, because there's quite a bit of overlap, these two military treatises were one and the same, and that only addenda were included in Sun Bin's version that differentiated the two works. So Sun Bin didn't know this yet, but there was a conspiracy afoot that essentially called for him to be murdered after he had finished writing this book. And one day, one of Sun Bin's assistants was able to get wind of this foul plan that Pang Juan was hatching, and he was able to get word to Sun Bin. And as the ancient books tell us, suddenly Sun Bin remembered this silk brocade bag that Guiguzi had given to him before he departed from Ghost Valley. And he opened it up, and there were 3 Chinese characters inside, instructing him to act like he was mentally deranged and not to exhibit any kind of normal behavior. So heeding this mysterious message from Guiguzi, he put on this very convincing act, and whenever any Wei officials came by to check up on him, Sun Bin feigned severe mental disability. Pang Juan was suspicious of this behavior and believed it to be an act of deception. So to test him, he ordered Sun Bin placed inside a pigsty, expecting he would give himself away faced with such an unpleasant circumstance. And once shoved inside with the pigs, Sun Bin at once began rolling around inside the enclosure and showed no sign of normal behavior. No one of sane mind would be acting in this fashion. So after a period of time, Pang Juan let his guard down and felt he had nothing to fear any longer. And so he no longer kept an eye on Sun Bin, nor feared him as a threat. Well, I'll pick up the pace here, but one day, diplomats from Qi State came and rescued Sun Bin, and there he moved into the home of Tianji. Tianji was one of the top military men in Qi State at the time. Qi was then ruled by King Wei. So Tianji took Sun Bin under his wing, and together these two scored major victories over Pang Juan and Wei State in 354 and 341 BC, with Pang Juan committing suicide following his defeat by the Qi forces led by Tianji and Sun Bin. Sun Bin was later offered high military positions, but he said to the king, in his present physical position, he wasn't in suitable shape to openly serve him. However, he agreed to become like an official advisor. So one day, Sun Bin did complete his book of military strategy, and this first edition of the Sun Bin Bing Fa was handed to King Xuan of Qi. And this book also became known as the Sun Zi Bing Fa, the Art of War. And for bestowing such valuable wisdom to the state, Qi King Xuan offered a reward to Sun Bin, but this was also refused. And following that, Sun Bin went into seclusion. The text, also known as Sun Bin's Art of War, appears to have been lost in the decades of chaos that came with the long, agonizing fall of the Han Dynasty. Sun Bin and his treatise on strategy were referred to often throughout history, but without an extant copy or ever appearing in its entirety in later compendia, this military treatise got overlooked, though, as I said, snippets of what Sun Bin had allegedly said appeared in later works. Then, in April 1972, there was another one of these milestone archaeological discoveries made in China, this time in Linyi, Shandong Province. Found inside two tombs from the 2nd century BC, not long after the events happened, there were scroll fragments of 16 chapters from Sun Bin's Art of War, 4,891 characters. These were known as the Yinqueshan Han Jian, the Han Tomb bamboo slips. Written on bamboo slips, the main writing substrate of the day, were not only 16 chapters from Sun Bin's Art of War, but fragments from Sun Tzu's Art of War as well. It took 1,400 years, but a reliable copy resurfaced, and Sun Bin got a nice promotion in the Hall of Fame of strategists of the Warring States period. So, the Guiguzi, intended originally to act as a guide to persuasion, the art of rhetoric, became more renowned as a guide to military strategy. And lacking any historicity to hang on to, this master of Demon Gorge, or Wang Chan, or Wang Li, or any other name he went by, became a figure from Chinese art and literature. And among the stories from ancient Chinese history that it yielded were these two that I briefly mentioned. But there was one entirely different dimension to the Guiguzi that I'd also like to mention. This was the Taoist aspect of the Guiguzi. Come the 5th and 6th centuries AD, during the time of the Liang Dynasty, Tao Hongjing came along and breathed eternal life into the Guiguzi with his commentaries on the text. And these commentaries on the Guiguzi, as well as the text Tao Hongjing received, are still the gold standard in the 21st century. Tao Hongjing was one of the most renowned men of his day. Because of Guiguzi's references to yin and yang in his teachings, Tao Hongjing infused the Guiguzi text with core elements from Taoism. Actually, the name Guiguzi was his Dao Hao, or Taoist name. Taoism considered Guiguzi a Zhenxian, a real immortal. Tao Hongjing was yet another figure from China history who, in their day, achieved so much renown across such a broad spectrum of the humanities, sciences, arts, and alchemical arts. Tao Hongjing was another in a millennia-long line of polymaths in China who also served the government in various capacities. And he lived from 456 to 536 during the Northern and Southern Dynasties period, serving rulers in the Liu Song, Southern Qi, and most notably, the Liang Dynasty, where he enjoyed a personal relationship with the founder, Emperor Wu, Liang Wudi. He was a very enthusiastic believer in Taoism and founded the Shangqing sect and had a passion for searching far and wide to find as many of the lost Taoist texts as possible, the Guiguzi being among them. Tao Hongjing believed Guiguzi possessed secret knowledge of a magical elixir and that he had first passed this secret knowledge to Xu Fu. You remember him? The alchemist who the Qin emperor sent on that wild goose chase between 219 and 210 BC to the east to search for this magical elixir. And then the secret was later passed on to Tao Hongjing. In his later years, up until his death in 536, Tao Hongjing retired to Maoshan and devoted himself to Taoism and growing the Shangqing highest purity sect of Taoism. And his association with the Guiguzi added a Taoist dimension to this work. He drew in those parts of the Guiguzi that contained philosophical and strategic teachings that aligned with Taoist principles such as yin and yang, living in harmony with the Tao, and the idea of wu wei, or non-action or effortless action. Well, for someone who remains as mysterious and obscure and downright ignored to some extent, the people who followed him were filled with nothing but praise for Guiguzi. Though he was a teacher to a group of major characters from the Warring States, and he was remembered as this hermit sage of Ghost Valley, his text, also called the Guiguzi, has been pretty much forgotten for the most part. And like I said at the outset, it would appear as if he had been canceled by later historians and lexicographers. Little known he may be, but there was a serial drama that came out on Youku at the end of 2019 called Mo Sheng Guiguzi, for the Holy Guiguzi. I'll have a link to that at the show notes so you could watch it. You know, the main problem with the sanctity of the Guiguzi is that scholars and historians have, for the most part, come to the conclusion that there was no Guiguzi, and therefore this whole text was not what it was purported to be. Too much indicated that it came out during the Han, not during the Warring States. Basically, there's too much sizzle and not enough steak as far as the historicity of this person who was known only as a teacher to several key figures of the 4th century BC. If you'd like to read a respected and oft-referenced translation, I'll put a link to Hui Wu's Guiguzi, China's first treatise on rhetoric, a critical translation and commentary. Everything you want to know about the Guiguzi and more can be found in this book. This episode was meant to be just a little intro to Guiguzi, the man and the book, both of which might never have existed. Chinese culture is chock full of these men, women, gods, goddesses, heroes, and heroines, and whether or not they ever walked this good earth, well, they became magnets for legends and stories that attach themselves to their legendary existence. So that's going to be all I have for you this time. Thanks again to Wei Zong for recommending this topic. You know, there's something about the Warring States period that I just can't get enough of, and I know a lot of you agree with me on that point. I get berated regularly by my children for constantly failing to make these appeals to the kind and generous nature of all CHP listeners. If you'd care to donate to the show or prescribe to my Patreon or CHP Premium, you'd have my greatest appreciation. If you're feeling up to it, go to the website at teacup.media and click on the support button. There you'll find all kinds of ways to show some love. Okay, that's all I got for you this time. This here's Laszlo Montgomery signing off from Los Angeles, California. Think about coming back again next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.